Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah wa nasalli ala rasulihi kareem. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for making time on a busy Saturday afternoon to share our thoughts about the Shair-e-Mashriq, Hazrat Allama Iqbal rahmatullah alayh. It proves indeed that Iqbal is indeed the Zinda Rood and very much alive in the hearts and minds of the people. His philosophy indeed transcending generations and enduring time. It is indeed a great privilege to be allowed to say a few words about Iqbal. And thank you, Waheed Sahab, for arranging this program. I really appreciate that. I was actually very sad that there was nothing going on Iqbal Day this time. As always, whenever conferred with such a privilege or concession being a more appropriate word, for I make no grandiose claims of having adequate knowledge or interpretive wisdom mandatory for comprehensive understanding of Iqbal. Neither am I at the literary competence level of quite a few of my attendees this afternoon. So I begin with a candid and honest confession of intellectual shortcoming and a request for exculpation in event of display of any or all of such shortcomings. My personal devotion to Iqbal rahmatullah alayh is deeply, deeply spiritual. Iqbal rahmatullah alayh was a powerful cordon in the front trenches against those who besieged truth, whether they were the occupying colonials or the native intellectuals, the mullahs or the mashayikh. His perpetual quest for truth and eternally simabi nature is what inspires me to constantly read and reread his work, and I rarely ever decline an opportunity to express my devotion for this fiery philosopher. Fiery and yet full of subtlety of mind and expression. The divinely discontent soul, full of fire to seek, rationalize, and understand the uncertain, the unexplored, and yet deeply content with the confidence of being. Self-actualized and yet self-perpetuating. Intellect incarnate and yet action resolute. To talk about Iqbal in a single session is tough. A.J. Arbery wrote, throughout his extremely active life, in which he did much to shape the destinies of the land of his birth and to mold the political future of the Muslim community, Iqbal maintained a steady and towards the end a torrential output of literature. Writing with equal felicity in Urdu, Persian and English, and in his soaring range covering law, philosophy and religion as well as politics. End quote. And to add to that, economics and history. And therein lies the predicament to talk about Iqbal when Iqbaliyat is a subject by itself, very vast. Ali Shariati wrote to describe Iqbal as a Persian poet, and this is a quotation from him. He said, to describe Iqbal as a Persian poet is to describe a pioneering thinker and a revolutionary like Luther as a man who had magnificent physique and a good handwriting, and to introduce him as such to the Christian world. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's eloquence in speaking of Iqbal is even more beautiful. If time permitted, I would have loved to read it verbatim. However, in précis, he suggested that Iqbal's multifaceted personality was not accidental, but embodiment of the spirit of Islam, which all exalted personalities are indeed embodying. Our blessed Prophet ﷺ's persona exemplified manifestation of multifarious facets of great leadership as well as personal exemplification. The virtues of Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu as a political leader, a military hero, a mystic arif, an eloquent orator, a wise hakim, and, I quote, a man who bears anguish, has patience, practices silence, and is loved, end quote, similarly reflect multidimensional excellence. And a man of Ali Khamenei's stature therefrom builds an argument extolling Iqbal in his customary eloquence. Quote, Iqbal is the offspring of such a family, and he's referring to Hazrat Ali and to the Prophet ﷺ. He's nurtured by such school of thought and action. He's a philosopher, politician, mujahid, scholar, mystic, Islamologist, and poet, and he is conversant with both Eastern and Western culture, end quote. He further continues to eulogize Iqbal's command over Western philosophy and yet the capability of Iqbal to retain his history, his native culture, and his faith. The quintessential intellectual and philosophical dryness, he says, do not deprive Iqbal of the beauty and subtlety of poetry. Politics doesn't dispossess him of strategic vision or philosophical insight. His religious convictions do not drive him to fanaticism, and mysticism does not make him a man of inaction. Ali Shariati wrote, Iqbal is a man of religion and a man of this world, a man of faith and knowledge, intellect and emotions, philosophy and literature, gnosis and politics, God and the people. He establishes personal ibadah and undertakes jihad. Who has ideology and culture, a man of yesterday, a man of today, and a man of tomorrow, a devotee during the night and a lion during the day. He is a Muslim, end quote. So friends, see what I am faced with. If a man of Ali Shariati and Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's eloquence, their stature, their intellect, merely introduce Iqbal in 5 chapters and lament that they didn't do justice, my humility knows no bounds. But in interest of time and concision, today I will limit my talk very briefly about Iqbal's philosophical take on the secrets of khud, self, the aesthetics of khudi, selfhood, and the etiquette of bekhudi, and the confluence of all towards the just and divine establishment of Khilafat-e-Adam. One aside that I will allow myself will be related to Iqbal's take on time, since it does provide a contextual backdrop for our discussion. And all of the above will be discussed against the backdrop of Iqbal's Persian poetry, Israr-e-Khudi and Ramuz-e-Bekhudi in general, and his magnum opus, Javid Nama in particular. The former two were published in 1915 and 1918 respectively, and Javid Nama was published in 1932, just a few years before his Rehlat. So profound was this poem that within a few years of its publication, scholars proclaimed its rank equivalent to Firdausi's Shahnameh, Rumi's Masnavi, Saadi's Gulistan, and Hafiz's Diwan. These accolades, tributes, and adjectives were certainly not an exaggeration. According to Arbery, in judging a poem, we have to consider 2 things, the style and the substance. So far as the style is concerned, Javid Nama belongs to the very first rank of Persian verse. It is unsurpassed in grandeur of expression, in beauty of diction, and in richness of illustration. As regards the theme, the poem deals with the everlasting conflict of soul, and by telling the story of human struggle against sin, shows to mankind the path to glory and peace, end quote. Javid Nama is conceived as a narrative poem, a poetic drama, if you will. It's a spiritual journey made by Iqbal from Earth through the various spheres of Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and then to the beyond spheres, and ultimately in the presence of the divine essence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As is abundantly apparent, the theme is broadly structured within the framework of the story of Miraj Sharif, the story of ascension of our blessed Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet's Miraj has formed a theme of meditation for many Muslim mystics over the centuries, and according to Arbery, Iqbal did not lack precedents and models when he came to adopt this very popular vehicle for the final expression of his doctrine of Muslim regeneration and self-realization. End quote. Iqbal was also inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy, which itself was inspired by the story of Miraj. Dante's masterpiece is structured around the medieval Christian theology, and Iqbal draws upon dialogue of spiritual discovery within the context of Islamic philosophy, but extending beyond by asking questions, challenging and also incorporating more ancient Indian faiths in this dialogue of discovery. Dante focuses on cardinal virtues and cardinal sins, whereas Iqbal questions the absoluteness of our definitions of right and wrong. He incorporates characters that have been both revered and some that have been reviled, and some which are just simply a matter of controversy. And he places them on stations with a tongue-in-cheek audacity to provoke thought, to provoke reflection. Coincidentally, however, Iqbal's choice of characters on each celestial station is somewhat reflective of the cosmic characteristics of virtues chosen by Dante. The allegorical representation of a soul's journey to the God is the same. But let me not digress into comparisons, for those are merely of scholarly interest. What matters more is the subject matter dealt with in the poem Javid Nama itself. Iqbal's choice of persons for this celestial journey is primarily drawn from those who had played a leading part in the history of Islam at a later period, and some of whom have had profound impact in shaping his own perspective, his own philosophy. Although I must hasten to add that a stalwart of Iqbal's stature was bestowed with a binai and a basirat of a magnitude and an intellect and a khudi that would scoff at walking in anybody's footsteps. Taqleed ki ravish se to behtar hai khudkushi, he said. Taqleed ki ravish se to behtar hai khudkushi, rasta bhi dhoond, khizr ka sauda bhi chhod de. So while he partakes from the collective wisdom of past, his path is entirely of his own making. Before proceeding further, I need to add an academic side note. Javid Nama has been translated into major languages like Italian, German, French, and English. In English, there are two major translations. One is Sheikh Mahmood's translation called The Pilgrimage of Eternity, and A.J. Arbery's Javid Nama. For my talk today, since I'm doing it in English, and I didn't actually realize that there are quite a few people who understand Farsi, so I relied on the English translation. And I'll be mostly using the latter's translation. In interest of academic honesty, though, I must declare that even as a weak student of Farsi at best, my untrained eye can catch loss of missed metaphors and infinite subtleties in translation. But let us not get mired in the translation inaccuracies. Iqbal himself sparked scholarly ire when in his own book, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, he translated his own verses from Javid Nama into English and took liberties which would have been inexcusable for any other scholar. Anyway, coming back to our topic, in this celestial journey, Iqbal, as he sojourns the spheres, is represented as Zinda-Rud, or Zinde-Rud, as our Persian friends will say. Zinda-Rud is a river that flows past Isfahan and literally translates as living stream. Now, the choice of this name by itself is an example of literary genius. Dr. Taracharan Rastogi says, live and inspired, Zinda-Rud is indeed Iqbal himself, a multi-splendid genius whose radiance does defy being bedimmed by the efflux of time. End quote. Dr. Rastogi points out the brilliance of the use of stream as a river and then finds commonalities as stream as William James's conception of stream of thought. A river is a beautiful metaphor, beautifully enhanced by adding the Jamesonian dimension of stream of thought. In either case, within Javid Nama, Iqbal expounds on the eternal struggle of rivers to their ultimate destination, the oceans, yet maintaining their identity through cognition of self, through khudi. Flight is the law that rules the Muslim life, he says. Flight is the law that rules the Muslim life. Its meaning is to quit the dew, the oceans to subdue. Yet again, you and I are waves of life's river. Every moment his universe changes, for life is gardish-e-peham, eternal revolution, says the spirit of Tipu Sultan to Zindarud. And the spirit of the Kashmiri poet Tahir Ghani suggests to Zindarud, how long shall we strike at each other in this sea? Rise up, let's break together against the shore. Our child, this is to say, yon ancient river, fills with its roar valley and mountains and meadow. Continually it smites the rocks on its path until it uproots the very fabric of the mountains. To live in the bounds of the shore is a sin. Our shore is but a stone in our path. To accommodate oneself to the shore is eternal death. Even though you roll in the sea morning and evening, life is to leap amidst mountains and deserts. Happy is the wave that transgresses the shores. And indeed, the divine majesty itself, at the end, asks Zindarud to travel alone, yet go with all. So even in naming himself as a river, Iqbal has delivered a masterstroke of literary genius. The name itself encapsulating various elements allegorical and metaphorical significance, hinting at the age-old Sufi doctrinal dilemma of fana and baqa and the philosophical dimensions of identity and eternal struggle. The name itself merits a whole talk. However, let us now move on to unveil the cast of this celestial quest, the dramatis personae, if you will. And as I introduce each one, I will very briefly give introduction to those who are lesser known. We will not dwell upon individual dialogues of each with Zindarud, since our time today will not permit that, nor will I, if I dare say, the attention span of our audience, or my back for that matter. Once we introduce the characters, we will proceed to the essence of dialogues en masse, focusing on the aspects of khudi, be-khudi, the essence of life in context of man's visurgence, and the concept of time. We will be omitting many major subjects, both philosophical and political, because today's talk will serve, hopefully, as an introduction, not necessarily an exhaustive analysis, and hopefully encourage all of us to go back and read Javid Nama. Zindarud's guide in this journey is Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, whose literary style and theology transcends boundaries, and his Masnavi endures in spite of so many after him. Iqbal himself was a spiritual disciple of this 13th century saint. The next character is Zarwan, who conducts Zindarud on his journey to the supernatural world. To give us a background of Zarwan, Zarwan is the spirit of time and space. Hazrat Zartusht lived in the circa 1750 BC and was the first one to propagate the idea of a monotheistic God. He called his God creator of wisdom, Ahura Mazda. His world was created in Mazda Ahura, which is a reversal of the word, meaning wisdom in creation, by way of evolution. And the very essence of evolution is time. Zarwan or Zurwan means time, and time alone is the most undeniably important factor in the universe. Logically, before God came into being, there had to be time and space in which God could come into being. And that time and space was called Zaman Akarne, the eternal time. Theologically, according to the religion of that time, infinite time had to exist for God to self-create himself, and time doesn't do anything except facilitate creation. Zervan tells Zindarud that time is a matrix of everything you see, and all are prisoners to my talisman, except one who has in his heart, I have a time with God. Now this is a reference to a very popular hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said that I have a time with God in which none of the angels and none of the prophets rival me. So time itself, at the very beginning of Javid Nama, tells Zindarud that everyone is lost or at loss or is in a matrix except those who can follow in the footsteps of the Prophet and have time with God. Next, in this affair of moon, Zindarud encounters Jahan Dost and Sarosh. Within this affair, he also encounters Gautam Buddha, the dancing girl, Ahriman, Zarathustra, Tolstoy, Efrangin, and Abu Jahl in the imaginary Tawasin, the valleys of Yargambit. Jahan Dost now is actually Vishwamitra. He was a mythological ancient king from Ramayana who forsake his kingdom to seek exaltation as a Brahma Rishi. He was also a teacher to Ram. The Hindu Gayatri mantra is attributed to him. In the poem, Zindarud actually experiences the legendary short temper before Vishwamitra discloses 9 of his subtleties to him, which coincidentally are derived from the Hindu Gayatri mantra. Sarosh is the Mazdian angel of obedience and spiritual equivalent to Gabriel as the angel of man and as the active intellect. Buddha, Ambampali, the dancing girl from Vishali, who became his disciple, Zarathustra, Tolstoy, and Abu Jahl are relatively known figures, so I will not dwell on introducing them. Ahriman is the Mazdian equivalent of Iblis, or Satan. Now, Efrangin is an interesting metaphorical embodiment of Europe as an enchanting, beautiful woman. Next, in this affair of Mercury, Zindarud encounters Jamaluddin Afghani and Sayyid Halim Pasha. Iqbal held both of them in very high regard and dedicates an extensive chapter to them, touching upon political debate about religion and country, comparative analysis between communism and capitalism, comparing Eastern and Western way of life and political discourse, moves on to the foundations of an Islamic state, elaborating on issues of man's vicegerence, laying the foundations of sources of legislation, the Holy Book, the sources of sovereignty, and importance of advancement in logic, science, and technology, and even a focus on educating for the reason of inculcating wisdom as opposed to merely a way to provide provision to earn money. It ends with a politically charged message to the Russians. Iqbal's poetic genius weaves such a dry and difficult dialogue into delightful verse. Now remember, these two gentlemen are somewhat closer to Iqbal's time, and their political contributions were very relevant to the struggles of the Indian Muslims in the subcontinent at that time. They played their part in trying to shape Muslim thought and destiny at a time when profound and dynamic restructuring of the world was ongoing, and at a time when Ummah stood weakened. So Iqbal dedicates a lot of time and detail to this affair. This chapter has a thought-provoking discussion on the then relatively new concept of modern nation-states and their long-term ramifications for the Muslims. Jamaluddin Afghani, 1838 to 1897, just to give a sense of time, is recognized as the founder of Islamic modernism. However, the same entailed no compromise on traditional religious values. He did emphasize the value of education and adoption of Western science and technology, and wanted to hold a constructive debate to inject resilience in Muslim states and to promote pan-Islamism. Sayyid Halim Pasha was the Grand Vizier to the Ottoman Empire, and he was brought in at a time to counterbalance the Committee of Union and Progress, the Turkish Nationalist Party. He was one of the last few who advocated reform and union with egalitarianism among the Ottoman subjects at large, regardless of ethnicity, and was antithetic to the idea of Turkish nationalism per se. His works has shaped the modern-day dialogue of nation-states as we undertake it even today within the context of Islamic philosophy. He was assassinated in 1921. Zinda Rud's next affair is Venus, where he interacts with the assembly of gods of the ancient people, and in particular, Baal. As he and Rumi plunge into the sea of Venus, they behold the spirits of Earl Kitchener, the Pharaoh, and the Sudanese Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmad Mahdi. Ironically, the Mahdi is in the same sphere as Lord Kitchener of Khartoum. In this chapter, Iqbal delivers an amusing dialogue through which ancient gods rejoice that an increasingly atheistic Western world will rediscover ancient gods in due time, since the advancement of excessive logic, not tampered by love or religion, will drive values of usurpation of power, Machiavellianism, and narcissistic self-absorption. Gleefully, Baal declares, "Ancient gods, rise, our time has come." And somberly, the Pharaoh tries to forewarn the newer pharaohs of the time, the imperialists, and says, what is the grand design of imperialism? To seek security by contriving division? For such evil doctrine, the fate of rulership declines, and the contrivances of rulership become void and confused. Next, Zinda Rud travels to the sphere of Mars, where its inhabitants have a Yargo-like advanced nation, accomplished in aesthetics, excelling in science, controlling space and time. The inhabitants of this sphere seem to have conquered the thorny issues of dualities, and imaginary city of Margadin is a futuristic idealist lofty state, a model city of Iqbal's imagination. Herein, Khudi is perfected and visurgence has been established. An interesting dynamic at this station is the emergence of a self-proclaimed Martian prophetess, which is Iqbal's abstract on a modern-day feminist incarnate. The so-called fruits of excessive female liberation and its impact on family structures and the fate of nations in the long run. Needless to say, Rumi hastens him to the next affair. Even Rumi doesn't want him to talk to feminists. In the sphere of Jupiter, Zinda Rud encounters the noble spirits of rebellious Sufis Mansoor Halaj, the poet that all of us know and love, Asadullah Khan Ghalib, and Qurratulain Tahira. We're all familiar with Mansoor and Ghalib. Tahira was a Babi poetess who tore her veil and refused obedience to Shariat and was executed during the Babi rebellion. Now this chapter is the finest example of mystic meditation. Zinda Rud cannot comprehend why these people that we hold in awe are exiled from the paradise and roam here. These free spirits, however, disdain even the confines of paradise and take pleasure in the agony of an eternal quest. Ghalib delicately probes the question of Makan and La Makan, hinting that continuously worlds are coming into existence. And Halaj suggests, you who seek your goal in annihilation, non-existence, can never discover existence. Interestingly, and yet again, metaphorical brilliance, Zinda Rood encounters Iblis in the same sphere. Now this is an Iblis who stands and is lamenting how his lofty ambitions have now been abased by easy prey, because man is so easy to lead astray. He does not feel challenged enough. He does not feel it's doing him justice as Iblis to have people like us. He says, his nature is raw, his resolution weak. This opponent cannot withstand one blow from me. I need a servant of God possessed of vision. I need a riper adversary. He actually continues to lament that he gave up his years of tapasya, years of service, years of ibadah, and for this, because the competition is not good enough. The next affair of Saturn is the station of traitors like Mir Sadiq of Bengal and Sadiq of Decca. This affair is symbolically inhabiting those vile spirits who so betrayed their nations that even hell rejected them and refused to take them. And finally, beyond this affairs, he meets the German philosopher Nietzsche, the patron of Kashmir, Sayyid Ali Hamdani, Shah Hamdan as he is more commonly known, the most eminent Kashmiri poet Tahir Ghani, the king who abandoned the world, Raja Bhartari Hari, the conqueror Nadir Shah, the savior Ahmad Shah Abdali, the philosopher poet Nasir Khusru, not Amir Khusru, but Nasir Khusru, who was an earlier poet. Most importantly, the martyr king Tipu Sultan, and ultimately beauty, Jamal Allah, as an aspect of God, until he is finally granted audience to the epiphany of the Divine Majesty. And in between there is a touching visit to the tomb of Sharfun Nisa. This final chapter indeed encapsulates the entire net sum of Iqbal's perspective of life. I would love to dwell on each one in detail. However, we are faced with time, so we shall move on. Indeed, actually, I wanted you to see, this is this thin little book, Javid Nama. And it actually requires probably chapters and chapters for each of the characters itself and the history preceding them. And each verse itself merits probably a single lecture itself. So that's the dilemma that I'm faced with, so I'm kind of rushing through. However, let's now move Zinda Ruh to the Ruh of this poem, the essence of Zinda Ruh's dialogue with this history. In this entire poem, and for that matter in a broader context of Iqbal's Persian work, I begin by commenting on with what great ease he establishes a communal, gratifying, and meaningful exchange between diverse texts and divergent thoughts. Nietzsche and Bergson, Mansour Halaj and Rumi, Aryans, the Semitics and the Brahmins, Bacon and Schopenhauer, the Persian dualists and the Greek dualists, to the Sufi Unitarians and the Sufi dualists, those and many, many more, and yet taken up, scrutinized, reinterpreted in the context of rereading the Quran. One persistent strand that is identified as the reason of being, which both differentiates and unifies, and which answers unanswered open questions, the concept of khudi. It is the central theme of this poem, and in words of Javed Majid, the mainstay of Iqbal's poetry is the philosophical explication and the aesthetic dramatization of khudi, end quote. Its expression is draped in aesthetics of poetry, a subtle yet strong expression, a vision of individual selfhood, and not a closely reasoned argument, logically consistent, but not confined by the precincts of logic. Iqbal's mind combines the subtlety of the Persian mind, which is, in his own words, is the butterfly of imagination flying half inebriated from flower to flower, with the subtlety of the Brahmin mind of his native soil, which in his words possesseth the awful sublimity of searching Vedanta. Iqbal's mind also combines the irreconcilable constraint of Western exactitude of philosophy, which is logic, aesthetics, ethics, politics, and metaphysics, with the post-Islamic Muslim philosophical endeavors confined by religious presuppositions. His poetic aesthetic of Khudi is Persian and Indian in two different dimensions of subtlety. Western and yet deeply Islamic, being anti-colonial in provenance and in pan-Islamism, and even so constructing a narrative in the verbose of European philosophy. Iqbal's esoteric aesthetic of Khudi, sublime and ethereal, expressed in modernity and yet infinite in existence, is an exquisite facet of his cosmopolitan eclectic. In Iqbal's aesthetic, the Nietzschean understanding of overman is expanded and expounded in the definition of the perfect man capable of niyabat-e-ilahi, differentiated A, on a level of development of Khudi fortified with knowledge and wisdom, B, ablaze by the fire of desire and love, C, charged with action, and D, capable of self-discipline to steer self and the world. And I have a translation from Javid Nama. Death, grave, uprisings, judgment are his estates. And this is talking about man. The light and the fire of the other world are his works. Himself, you are the Imam, the prayer, the sanctuary. Himself, you are the ink, the book, the pen. Little by little, what is hidden in you becomes visible. It has no boundaries, its kingdom no frontiers. Your being gives value to contingent things. What shall I declare? Your shore, a shore without, your sea, a sea without shore. All ages, all times are drowned in your heart. That which is contained in man is the world. This one is important. That which is contained in the man is the world. And that which is not contained within world is man. Sun and moon are manifest through yourself. Even Gabriel cannot penetrate your privacy. Loftier than heavens is the station of man, and the beginning of education is respect for man. The Bergsonian understanding of lived time, of historicity beyond the objective, spatialized fixation of cosmic time, is reconsidered by Iqbal's reinterpretation of Quranic concept of destiny, propounding an unadulterated idea of time. Iqbal says, pure time has no length, and the personal immortality is an aspiration achievable with effort, depending on our adopting in this life modes of thought and activity that maintain this state of tension. Buddhism, Sufism, and karma-driven nirvana seeking ethics are opiates. He calls Sufism, the karma-driven nirvana, as opiates, narcotics which are needed, but like nights in the day of life, occasionally used. Thus, if the goal is maintenance of the state of tension, the shock of death is unlikely to impact it. The interval of relaxation, the barzakh until the day of resurrection, will be survived by those who took care of it while abiding this transient body. Reynold Nicholson translates Iqbal's thoughts in Israr-e-Khudi as follows. Although life abhors repetition in its evolution, yet on Bergson's principles, the resurrection of body too, as William Carr says, is quite possible. By breaking up time into moments when we spatialize it and then find difficulty in getting over it. The true nature of time is reached when we look deeper in ourselves. Real time is life itself, which can preserve itself by maintaining that particular state of tension for which it has so far achieved. We are subject to time so long as we look at time as something spatial. Spatialized time is a fetter which life has forged for itself in order to assimilate to the present environment. In reality, we are timeless. The ruh is timeless. and it is possible to realize our timelessness even in this life, end quote. So see with what great ease Iqbal enters the concept of khudi to answer the Bergsonian question. He was convinced that the system of universe originates in khudi, and that perpetual continuation of all individuals depends on strengthening your khudi. The form of existence is an effect of khudi. Whatever you see is a secret of self. Khudi's awakening to consciousness revealed the universe of thought. It rises, it kindles, it falls, it glows, it breathes, it burns, it shines, it walks, and it flies. The limitless spaciousness of time is its arena, and heavens a mere billow of dust on its road, says Iqbal. Unexpressed and inert power chains the faculties of action. Life of universe comes from strengthening the khudi, and in fact, life is in proportion to this strength. Aesthetically, Iqbal avails various metaphors to elucidate. A drop of water, armed with khudi, can transform itself into a pearl. A black stone can burn into insignificance or endure weights of centuries and 1,000 cuts to become a diamond and adorn a king's crown. Or, if you are truly to become infused with khudi, infuse yourself with so much khudi that you will have the self-same stone be kissed by millions who perform tawaf around it. Rai zore khudi se parbat, parbat zofe khudi se rai. Next, Iqbal looks at Schopenhauer's, if you wish to make everything subject to you, subject yourself to reason. He accepts the latter in the Quranic light of self-control. Schopenhauer's purification and freedom of will, the tazkiyah-e-nafs part, but makes a distinction between self-control and self-negation. Iqbal reinterprets it not to denounce will, nor to abhor servitude it, but in fact to celebrate it, exalt it, and make it worthy of servitude, of guidance to the next step, and indeed to the conquest of the world, because visurgence is the divine right of a perfect man. What is this wave of existence, he ponders? A sword. He answers, what is khudi, the cutting edge of this sword? Iqbal takes a diametrically opposite approach to Schopenhauer. The latter propounds freedom of will by taking emotion out of rational beings, leaving, as he said, the accidental and the foreign out. Pierce through passion and reveal the heart of things, leaving your own out. He then transitions to the Platonian idea of universal essence, wahdatul wajud, meanders through his theory of art to the theory of religion, leading him to pessimism and fatalism, concluding ultimate wisdom in nirvana, to reduce oneself to minimum of desire and will. The less the will, the less we suffer, says Schopenhauer. Iqbal's take on this is aggressively converse. He wants the freedom and the strengthening of khudi by clearly establishing the ascendancy of love over knowledge. Khudi ho ishq se mehkam to ghairate Jibrail. Khudi ho ishq se mehkam to ghairate Jibrail. Agar ho ishq se mehkam to Surah Israfil. Iqbal denounces self-negation as a source of clarity of understanding will. While he has dealt with this in multiple places in his writing, my personal favorite is an aesthetically appealing, beautiful rendition of Israr-e Khudi, of a herd of sheep converting tigers to vegan diet, and I apologize to any vegetarians here, and eventually annihilate the tiger's wajud. And the poem ends like this. Their should died and their bodies became tombs. Obviously, if a tiger is going to eat grass, he's not going to last long. Bodily strength diminished while spiritual fear increased. Spiritual fear robbed them of courage. Lack of courage producing 100 diseases. Poverty, low-mindedness. The wakeful tiger was lulled to slumber by the sheep's charm, the sheep's philosophy. He called this, his decline, moral culture. Iqbal accepts Schopenhauer's theory of art partially, though. His own philosophical renditions draped in the aesthetic of poetic art are a logical corollary of such acceptance. However, he rejects his theory of religion based on innate pessimism therein and the doctrine of minimizing desire and the will to reduce suffering. Iqbal is appalled. A. He's not afraid of suffering. Agar आसानियां हो जिंदगी दुश्वार हो जाए. B. Iqbal's entire manifestation of Islamic spirit is predicated on using desire, talab, arzu, justaju, as a necessary food for strengthening khudi, your selfhood, your will to attain perpetuity. Iqbal cares not much for the Platonic idea of wahdatul wujud that transgresses into Sufism for fana, into the one, in quest for eternity. Iqbal's ideal perfect man is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who attained ultimate ascendancy, Miraj, in the presence of the One, and came back to fulfill the dictates of his khudi, his duty on earth, to do and continue to do what the One wants man to do on earth. A Sufi would have never come back, like Idris alayhi salam. If the arzu is unity with One, and the matlub is Jannah only, then Idris attained it without death. But to Muhammad Arabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, self-actualization is beyond. He is the matlub and mehboob as much as the One. Ahad loves Ahmad as much as Ahmad loves Ahad. Ahad sends durood to Ahmad's hamd. Ahmad's khawas, as elucidated in his 99 names, mirror quite a few khawas of Ahad himself. But the Nietzschean overman is not Schopenhauer's Platonic pessimist, nor is he the Sufi seeking baqa in fana. He seeks for man to exalt himself, to be reflective of God's characteristics, seeking oneness of spirit through reflecting and absorbing, but not becoming absorbed, not losing his own identity in the presence of the One. His khudi is so advanced that the One shall ask him of his heart's desire. He will be the master of his own fate. Life means to adorn oneself in one's writing. And these are the words said by Rumi in Javid Nama. Life means to adorn oneself in oneself, to desire to bear witness to one's own being. The concourse on the day primordial arrayed desired to bear witness to their own being. Art thou in the stage of life, death, or death in life? Invoke the aid of these three witnesses to verify your station. The first witness is thine own consciousness. See thyself, then in thine own light. The second witness is the consciousness of another ego. See thyself, then in the light of an ego other than thee. The third witness is God's consciousness. See thyself then in God's light. If thou standest unshaken in front of this light, consider thyself as living, as eternal as He Himself. For life is but to reach thy destined end, that is, to see your Lord, your beloved, unveiled. One who believes shall never lose himself in the attributes. For Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam insisted on the sight. The flight to heaven means longing for a witness who may testify thyself until it is confirmed by him. Our life is nothing but a play of rangobu. No one can stand against his beauty bright except those who have perfection reached. Thy ego's knot tighten up then, so thou can stand in that light. The aesthetic dimension of khudi is self-divinity in which there is ontological equality between God and self. When the self is actualized perfectly, an entity that, in the words of Iqbal, consciously participating in creative life of his maker. Here Iqbal takes a very classic Sufi concept of insane kamil and inverts it. He elevates Sufism to Kalandari in the light of Hazrat Ali. The Meh of Tawheed needs the jam of a Qalandar's heart to give it shape. I'll repeat that. Yeah. The Meh of Tawheed, the wine of Tawheed, needs the jam, the cup of the Qalandar's heart to give it shape. The nafs, the qalb, the ruh are all intertwined, and yet the qalb is the one that unites the other two. So the khudi as a house, khudi that is housed in your heart, is the center for this relationship between man and God. And herefrom emanates the most dramatic dimension of Iqbal's aesthetic of selfhood, ascension from the height of self-cognition, attaining ultimate khudi into the realm of rapture, selflessness, bekhudi. Yet it is not a rapture of fana, nor is a state of aimless mindlessness. Rapture is the journey of self-discovery, rapture in the pursuit of your khudi, rapture in fulfilling your divine duty of visurgence, rapture in your knowledge of perpetuity, rapture in the knowledge of your free will in being your own master, rapture in loving God and being loved by Him, rapture of His gaze, the gaze of your Lord, and the rapture of His presence. Bekhudi of Iqbal highlights the very intensity of khudi, from the powerful imagery of a wave immobilized in the gem. So the song of imprisoned birds to the songs of intense ishq, bekhudi thereof. Raptures of meditation, reflection, spiritual, philosophical debates. Not as opiates of soul, nothing that will dull your senses, but a furnace for action in pursuit of love and visurgence. Bekhudi is also a dimension of Iqbal's political aesthetic, disciplining liberation singularities into structure of ummah for perpetuating communal and global goals and global good in deliverance of your duties as a perfect man. In the end, I'll just recite one little part of the words of the divine beauty, the Jamal Allah, as it speaks to Iqbal right at the end of, almost at the end of the Javid Nama. Life is not a mere repetition of the breath. Its origin is from the living, eternal God. The soul near to Him who said, "Lo, I'm nigh," that is to take one's share of everlasting life. The individual through the unity becomes divine. The nation through the unity becomes omnipotent. Unity produced by Yazid, Shibli, Abu Zar Ghaffar. Unity produced for the nations Tughril and Sanjar. Without the divine epiphany, man has no permanence. Our manifestation is life to individual and the nation. Both attain their perfection through unity. Life being for the latter majesty, for the former beauty. The one is for Solomon, Hazrat Sulaiman alayhi salam, the other is for Salman Farsi. The one perfect poverty, the other all power. The one sees there is one, the other becomes one. While in the world sit with the former, but live with the latter. What is this nation who you declare no God but God? What is this nation that declares La ilaha illallah? With 1,000 eyes to be one in vision, the proof and claim of God's people are always one. Our tents are apart, our hearts are one. Oneness of vision converts the motes to the sun. Be one of vision, that God may be seen unveiled. Do not look slightly on oneness of vision, for that is the true epiphany of unity. When a nation becomes drunk with unity, power, yea, omnipotence, something that is God's characteristic, lies in your grasp. Thank you very much.